Imagine sitting in a quiet classroom. A girl starts to laugh. At first, nobody thinks much of it. Maybe she heard a joke. Maybe she is just in a strange mood. But then she keeps laughing. Minutes pass, then hours. Her laughter becomes uncontrollable, violent, painful, impossible to stop. Soon other students begin laughing too, then dozens, then hundreds. People cannot concentrate, they cannot sleep, they cannot work. Some cry while laughing, some collapse. Schools shut down, entire communities are thrown into panic, and no one knows why it is happening. No virus is found, no poison is confirmed, no supernatural curse can be proven. Yet the outbreak spreads anyway, turning laughter, the thing we usually connect with joy, into something terrifying. This is the story of one of history's strangest medical mysteries, the deadly epidemic that started with laughter. In 1962, in a small village near Lake Victoria, in what is now Tanzania, something began that would confuse doctors, terrify families, and leave historians debating what really happened for decades. It became known as the Tanganyika laughter epidemic, and despite the harmless sound of its name, there was nothing funny about it. This was not normal laughter. This was prolonged, involuntary, exhausting laughter, often accompanied by crying, restlessness, pain, breathing problems, and emotional breakdowns. It disrupted schools, villages, and daily life on a massive scale. At its height, the outbreak affected hundreds of people, mostly children and young adults, and forced institutions to close. But to understand how an entire region could be overtaken by uncontrollable laughter, we have to begin with the world these people were living in, because outbreaks like this do not appear out of nowhere. They grow in silence first, in stress, in fear, in lives stretched to the limit. The year was 1962. Tanganyika had only recently gained independence from British colonial rule. The country was young, the political atmosphere was changing, and communities across the region were adjusting to a new future, filled with both hope and uncertainty. For outsiders, independence often looks like a triumphant moment, a clean break between oppression and freedom. But for the people actually living through it, the reality is often far more complicated. New nations are fragile, institutions are unstable, expectations rise faster than conditions improve, families feel pressure, schools change, authority shifts. Social systems that once seemed fixed begin to move beneath people's feet. And in rural communities, those pressures can become especially intense. The laughter epidemic began in the village of Kashasha, at a mission-run boarding school for girls. The school was strict, discipline mattered, obedience mattered, performance mattered. Most of the students were teenagers, young, impressionable, under pressure, and living in an environment where emotional strain often had nowhere to go. This matters, because when historians and psychologists later look back at the epidemic, they notice something important. The outbreak did not begin in a random market or across all age groups equally. It began in a highly controlled environment among students, young people living under rules, expectations, and social tension. The first reports suggest the outbreak started on January 30th, 1962. 3 girls began laughing, not smiling, not giggling, laughing uncontrollably. At first it may have seemed like a disruption, a strange incident, maybe nerves, maybe imitation, maybe adolescent behavior spinning out of control. But it did not stop. And then it spread. Soon more students were affected. The laughter came in waves. In some cases it lasted hours, in others much longer. The students were not experiencing happiness. Many were distressed, frightened, and physically drained. Some showed other symptoms too: crying, screaming, restlessness, fainting, and pain. Teachers and administrators were horrified. How do you stop an outbreak that is not clearly an illness? How do you discipline behavior that may not be voluntary? And how do you calm a school when no one understands what they are seeing? As the number of affected students rose, the school lost control. Eventually it was forced to close. But closing the school did not stop the epidemic. It helped spread it. When students returned to their families and villages, they did not leave the mysterious condition behind. They carried it with them. That is when the event transformed from a bizarre school incident into a regional crisis. Reports began to emerge from nearby communities. More people, especially young people, started showing similar symptoms: laughter, crying, agitation, emotional instability, sudden attacks that seemed to pass from one person to another without any obvious physical cause. In some places, entire households were affected. In others, schools became centers of transmission. The pattern was chilling, not because it behaved like a normal epidemic, but because it did not. There was no clear pathogen, no confirmed bacterial infection, no known toxin consistently linking the victims, no evidence of a conventional disease spreading through air, water, or food in the way public health officials would expect. And yet the outbreak moved through social networks with astonishing force. The more people witnessed it, the more it seemed to grow. Doctors, officials, and researchers were called in. What they found only deepened the mystery. The victims were not pretending, at least not in the simple sense. Their symptoms were real. Their distress was real. Their bodies were reacting. Their daily lives were being shattered. Some could not attend school. Some could not work. Some families were overwhelmed by fear and confusion. And because no satisfying medical explanation appeared, rumors began to fill the vacuum. Was it a curse? Was it poison? Was it punishment? Was it some kind of spiritual attack? In many communities, when science cannot immediately explain suffering, older explanations rush in to take its place. Not because people are irrational, but because uncertainty is unbearable. Human beings need causes. We need stories. We need to believe someone or something is responsible. And the stranger the symptoms, the darker those stories often become. Over time, the number of people affected grew into the hundreds. Different historical accounts vary on the exact number, but the outbreak is widely believed to have affected around 1,000 people to some degree over a period of many months. That number is staggering. This was not a single classroom prank, not a one-day hysteria, not a local curiosity exaggerated by rumor. This was a prolonged social and psychological crisis. Several schools had to be shut down. Communities were destabilized. Education was interrupted. Families were frightened. And the symptoms could be severe enough to make normal life impossible. The attacks reportedly lasted anywhere from minutes to hours, and in some cases much longer. Along with laughter came crying, fainting, rashes, pain, respiratory issues, and helplessness. The laughter itself may have been the most visible symptom, but it was not the only one. Now we need to slow down and be careful. The laughter epidemic is often dramatized online with claims that people literally laughed themselves to death. The truth is more complicated. Historical records do not clearly show large numbers of direct deaths caused by laughter itself. The outbreak was undeniably serious, disruptive, and harmful. But the phrase, deadly epidemic, reflects how dangerous and devastating the event felt to the people trapped inside it more than it proves that masses of victims dropped dead from laughing. And that distinction matters, because dark history becomes even more powerful when we tell it honestly. This was deadly in another sense. It attacked stability. It attacked community. It attacked mental well-being. It created suffering that medicine could not easily treat. And when human beings are pushed into extreme psychological distress, the consequences can become life-threatening, even without a traditional disease. Exhaustion can break the body down. Panic can destroy livelihoods. Fear can poison entire communities. A society does not need piles of bodies for an event to be catastrophic. Sometimes all it takes is the collapse of certainty. Medical workers and investigators began trying to identify the cause. At first, the most obvious explanation was some kind of physical illness. Was there something in the food? Something in the drinking water? Could this be a side effect of contaminated grain or spoiled supplies? Had a disease spread through the boarding school and then moved outward through family contact? But the deeper they looked, the stranger the case became. There was no single physical cause that consistently explained the outbreak. No clear infection. No laboratory evidence pointing to a conventional epidemic. No poison that tied together all the affected villages. The people were sick, but not in the way doctors expected. And that made the situation even more frightening. because a disease with no obvious cause feels less like an illness and more like a curse. The inability to explain the outbreak may have helped it spread, because fear is contagious, and unlike bacteria, fear does not need physical contact. It travels through stories. To understand the laughter epidemic, you have to understand how human beings react to fear inside close communities. Emotion is social. Panic is social. Stress is social. When one person in a tight-knit group begins showing dramatic symptoms, everyone around them is affected. They watch. They react. They imagine. They worry. Then they begin to ask the question that changes everything. Could it happen to me too? That question is powerful, because once the mind starts expecting danger, the body often follows. Heart rate changes, breathing changes, muscles tense, sleep becomes difficult. Small physical sensations feel larger and more ominous. The students at Kashasha were not isolated strangers. They lived together, studied together, watched each other constantly. Their emotional world was shared. So when the first girls began laughing uncontrollably, the event did not happen in a vacuum. It happened inside a highly social environment, one already shaped by discipline, stress, and uncertainty. When people hear mass psychogenic illness, they often misunderstand it. They imagine people pretending, faking, acting, making themselves sick for attention. But that is not what experts mean. The body is not separate from the mind. Stress does not remain politely inside thought. It enters the bloodstream. It changes breathing, digestion, sleep, immunity, perception, and pain. Under extreme stress, the body can produce real symptoms with terrifying intensity. A person can faint, shake, hyperventilate, lose coordination, feel chest pain, develop nausea, cry uncontrollably, or in rare cases become trapped in waves of involuntary laughter. The laughter epidemic reminds us of something history often tries to hide. The human nervous system has limits, and when those limits are crossed through fear, repression, uncertainty, trauma, or overwhelming pressure, the results may look unnatural, even supernatural, but they are still human. In many ways, that is more unsettling than a ghost story, because it means the threat does not come from outside. It comes from what stress can do to us when too much is endured for too long. One of the darker dimensions of this story is the timing. The outbreak happened just after Tanganyika's independence. Colonial rule leaves scars that do not vanish the moment a flag changes. Institutions remain unstable. Generations raised under one system are suddenly told to adapt to another. Young people are told they represent the future, while often being given little control over their own lives. And children often absorb the stress adults fail to name. If emotion cannot be safely expressed, it may erupt in distorted forms. Seen that way, the laughter epidemic was not a random absurdity. It may have been an eruption, a nervous system rebellion, a collective breakdown in a place where breakdown was never supposed to happen. Laughter is supposed to comfort us. It belongs to celebration, friendship, joy, relief. It is one of the most human sounds in the world. That is exactly why this story is so unsettling, because once laughter is stripped from its normal meaning, it becomes horrifying. Imagine hearing someone laugh and realizing they are not amused. They are suffering. They cannot stop. Their face is twisted. Their breathing is broken. Their eyes are wet with panic. Their body is shaking with exhaustion. Now imagine a room full of people doing the same thing. That is not comedy. That is nightmare. There is something ancient and deeply disturbing about seeing a positive human expression become grotesque. It destroys our trust in the body's signals. It tells us that a smile may not mean happiness. A laugh may not mean pleasure. The familiar may become alien without warning. It forces us to confront a terrible possibility, that the body can betray meaning itself. As strange as the laughter epidemic was, it was not the only time history recorded groups of people behaving in ways that seemed inexplicable, contagious, and terrifying. There were episodes of dancing manias in medieval Europe, where groups of people danced uncontrollably for days, sometimes collapsing from exhaustion. There were convent outbreaks where nuns reportedly displayed bizarre collective behavior, interpreted at the time as possession. There were factory panics, school fainting outbreaks, and communities struck by waves of trembling, nausea, or paralysis without a clear medical cause. Every era gives these events its own language. In one age, people say demons. In another, nerves. In another, hysteria. In another, social contagion. The vocabulary changes, but the pattern remains. A group under pressure, a symptom that emerges and spreads, an authority structure struggling to explain it, and a society forced to confront the possibility that people can become sick together in ways that defy ordinary logic. There is another dark layer to stories like this, and it is one history often overlooks. What happens to victims when their illness cannot be proven in the usual way? If no virus is found, some people assume the victims must be lying. If no toxin is discovered, they are dismissed as dramatic. If a symptom looks bizarre, people laugh at it, ironically in this case, when the victims themselves could not control their laughter. But imagine living through such an event and not being believed. Imagine your body locking into distress while teachers accuse you of acting up. Imagine your family wondering if you are cursed. Imagine doctors unable to explain what is happening. The victims are sick, but the world often treats them as if their sickness is less real, because it cannot be neatly scanned, cultured, or isolated in a lab. A person does not need a wound for their life to collapse. A community does not need corpses in the street to be overtaken by fear. And perhaps the deepest cruelty was this. They may have suffered while knowing that many around them could never fully understand what they were experiencing. Today we tend to think of ourselves as more rational than past societies. We have medical technology, psychological research, global communication, and endless information at our fingertips. And yet we are still astonishingly vulnerable to collective panic. In 1962, a frightening symptom had to travel from person to person through villages and schools. Today, panic can cross continents in minutes. Anxiety no longer needs physical proximity. It can spread through a screen. That does not mean every modern fear is irrational, but the mechanism of amplification is the same. Humans watch each other for cues. We mirror distress. We absorb group emotion. We become the environments we inhabit. The laughter epidemic matters today because it proves that human beings are not just biological organisms. We are social nervous systems. What surrounds us gets inside us. And if that environment is saturated with fear, tension, and helplessness, the results can be profound. Perhaps not always in the form of laughter, but in insomnia, panic attacks, burnout, dissociation, collective outrage, paralyzing dread. History changes costumes, but not always patterns. On the surface, the laughter epidemic may seem different from the wars, massacres, and atrocities usually associated with dark history. There is no single villain, no battlefield, no dictator issuing orders. So why does this story belong in the world of unforgiven history? Because unforgiven history is not only about evil acts, it is also about neglected suffering, about the wounds history leaves unexplained, about people who endured something real, terrifying, and destabilizing, only to have their pain turned into trivia. The victims of the laughter epidemic are rarely remembered as individuals. They are remembered as a strange event, a curiosity, an anecdote. But they were people, young people, people whose bodies became battlegrounds for pressures they may not even have had words for. And perhaps that is one of history's quietest injustices. Some suffering is not denied outright. It is simply reduced, minimized, filed away under bizarre. That too is a kind of forgetting. In 1962, a few students at a girls' school began to laugh. Then others joined them. Then villages began to panic. Then schools closed. Then an entire region found itself trapped inside one of the strangest outbreaks in recorded history. No army invaded. No visible plague arrived. And yet normal life still began to break apart. That is the dark lesson of the laughter epidemic. Not all historical disasters come with blood and smoke. Some arrive as a sound, a laugh in the wrong moment, a body behaving the wrong way, a community realizing that something invisible has entered the room, and no one knows how to stop it. And maybe that is why this story still lingers, because somewhere beneath the absurdity is a truth we do not like to admit. Human beings are far more fragile, far more connected, and far more vulnerable to unseen forces than we want to believe. The deadly epidemic that started with laughter was never really about laughter. It was about fear, pressure, contagion, and the terrifying moment when the human mind becomes history's most mysterious weapon against itself. If you want more stories about the darkest, strangest, and most unforgiven chapters of history, subscribe now, because history does not just remember wars and kings. Sometimes it remembers the moments when reality itself seemed to break.